Thank you for joining this advanced CTE webinar, exploring the research on innovative CTE delivery models. My name is Haley Wing, and I am the Senior Policy Associate here at Advanced CTE. This session is one of the many in a series of Advanced CTE webinars to support you in learning more about the cutting edge and innovative work we're seeing related to CTE across the country. This session will be recorded and shared on the Advanced CTE website for your reference. If you have any questions at any time, we encourage you to submit them via the Q&A box on your screen, and you are also welcome to contribute to the conversation by typing into the chat box. With that, let's go ahead and get started. So we're so glad to welcome you to this webinar to learn from our panelists, each other, and engage to discuss innovative CTE delivery models. The focus of this webinar directly aligns with our shared vision for CTE without limits. This vision was created in partnership with nearly 200 national and state local leaders representing the full continuum of CTE, with the goal to design and co-create a shared vision, which would serve as a true north for the CTE community and key partners. All of the contributions were synthesized into the Without Limits document released in March 2021. This vision is rooted in the belief that each learner must have access to and the means to be successful in the career of their choice. We know that to accomplish this vision, it requires that all systems are working in concert to advance this vision, and that all partners and systems are coming together to say that this is what we believe and we're willing to collaborate to do it, which also requires a commitment to tearing down barriers that limit opportunities. Today, we'll be touching on one of the solutions to the geographic barrier that can often be a limitation within a state as well as across states, and we believe that CTE and innovative delivery models can be positioned as a catalyst to make this vision a reality. To date, we have more than 40 national organizations that have joined with us to support this vision, and they've all signaled their commitment to using this vision to advance their own work and the goals that we have collectively set. We realize that no one organization or sector can fully realize the aspiration of this vision alone, and only by working together can this vision of CTE without limits become a reality within and across states. Within the vision, we've identified these 5 principles that are important to building a flexible, cohesive, and responsive career ecosystem that attends to the fact that all learners can be welcomed and supported by and successful in the system that is anchored in providing opportunities for career navigation, so that wherever learners are in their journey, they have the information, tools, and supports that they need to be successful. We also have a few foundational commitments to achieve the vision, which you'll hear in our discussions with our panelists today, and they are equity, and this includes all dimensions of equity, quality programs and instructors, meaningful partnerships where industry are deeply invested and involved in the design, delivery, and success of our system, not just transactionally, but really more in like a symbiotic partnership, a commitment to actionable, transparent, and trustworthy data, and finally, a commitment to continuous improvement and leadership at all levels within our system, because we know this work cannot be accomplished alone or at just one level. Although all principles in this vision are equally important to drive us forward, today our webinar focuses and directly aligns with Principle 5, which is that each learner can access CTE without borders. This principle really calls on states to collaborate even more than they have in the past to expand access and remove those geographic barriers for learners. And this requires states to come together to develop and expand new models of collaboration, invest in cross-state and in-state open access systems, as well as create some common frameworks for defining and delivering CTE. This principle really emerged because of the impact of the pandemic, and though the pandemic has been increasingly difficult in many ways, it has provided the opportunity to think about how we change the way we engage in education, see the system, and respond to challenges in an innovative way. So when we discuss this vision and what it looks like to accomplish this, we know that we must better connect education and the workforce to provide a common language and structural alignment to the bridge of education and work, and create more opportunities to empower learners to be able to explore, decide on, and prepare for the dynamic and evolving careers. We also know that we must develop interstate compacts to create more access to programs, to work-based learning, to credentials that may be limited options in states and communities. And finally, and what we'll explore more today, is investing in and exploring research development to ensure that the virtual opportunities are quality, equitable, and meaningful for learners. So with that, I'm going to take a moment to introduce our panelists who are going to be talking about the work that they engage in as it relates to this principle and some of the lessons that they have learned from their unique positions. So I'm first going to let the panelists I'm first going to share a little bit about the panelists and then allow them to introduce themselves so that they can share more about the work that they do. And then we're going to focus on some discussion questions that highlight some of the helpful lessons learned from their work. Then we'll open it up from questions that you all have. And as our panelists are sharing, please, again, feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box on your screen or contribute by typing into the chat box. So to introduce our panelists, we first have Shane Spalding, who is a senior fellow in the Income and Benefits Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where her work focuses on the evaluation of workforce development and post-secondary education programs. She has spent more than 20 years in the workforce development field as an evaluator, technical assistance provider, and program manager. We also have Al Leaston, who is a program director in the IT division at Wake Tech Community College, where he provides leadership to the network management program. He leads several initiatives at Wake Tech, such as the CTE CoLab grant, which aims to reduce equity gaps for students of color. He also works with several Wake Tech community partners on the 110 initiative, which seeks to cultivate economic opportunities for Black talent in America who do not have a four-year degree and provide family-sustaining careers. And lastly, we have Tara Smith, who is an associate research director at Jobs for the Future, also known as JFF. She leads research, coaching, and technical assistance services for workforce development and community. So we're going to let Shane kick us off by sharing a little bit more about her work to help our audience learn more about some of the things that she does and the work that she's engaging in. So I'll go ahead and let Shane take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Haley. I'm really excited to be here today with all of you. And so I'll just share a little bit about myself and then about some of the project that I'm going to talk about today. And for those of you who don't know Urban, next slide. For those of you who don't know Urban, the Urban Institute is a national nonprofit organization. It's a research organization based in Washington, D.C. I'm actually based in the Boston area. And our mission is to open minds that shape decisions and to really inform both policy and practice from across the country. Next slide. So I help to lead a team at Urban that's called the Building America's Workforce team. And it focuses on a number of different issue areas that have to do with improving the lives and outcomes for workers. We conduct rigorous research, we engage in policy analysis, and we support improved practice through technical assistance and capacity building. In terms of alternative delivery models, we do work on competency-based education, work-based learning, including apprenticeships, micro-credentials, stackable credentials, and career pathways. And then we've also done quite a bit of research related to the pandemic, including looking at digital skills, looking at sort of adaptations that programs made across the country during the pandemic. And then we have policy papers on strategies to support workers during and following the pandemic. Next slide. So as part of this, we launched in 2020 the CTE CoLab, and I'm going to focus on that today. So this is supported by ECMC Foundation. So as CTE programs are increasingly moving online or in the hybrid format, the CTE CoLab aims to reduce inequities in academic and career outcomes for students of color, especially focusing on students who are Black, Latinx, or Indigenous, and enrolled in credit-bearing online post-secondary CTE programs. Urban leads a group of 5 national partners in this work, and we're supporting a community of practice that is made up of 12 community and technical college CTE programs to help them ensuring that the shift to online is resulting in expanded access and stronger outcomes for students of color. And Al is one of our partners in that work, and so we're so excited to have Al here today and also just to be working with Wake Tech on this effort. So together, what we're really trying to do is build knowledge at this intersection. So if you look at this graph, you see CTE programs, racial equity, online programs, and right in the middle is where we're trying to build knowledge just for ourselves, because I think we're all learning how to do this better, but then also for the field. Next slide. So this is a very big, complicated graph, and I'm not going to walk through it today because we don't have time. but this is an image from our foundational research we did as part of this project. We did a landscape scan, we interviewed people, reviewed the literature to try to think about what does it mean to try to address racial equity gaps in online CTE specifically. And so there's a lot of detail here. I'm not going to go into it, but I think it would be great to link in the chat this paper, it could be a reference for folks. I think what's important to note here is that there's different levels you can take on the issue of racial equity gaps. And so here, we're thinking about the institutional level, the program level, and the online classroom level. Of course, there's also the state level, and I know we're going to talk more about that today, and the federal level. But just thinking about what does it mean to take an equity-centered approach at all of these levels. And then the part in blue shows what we call the overarching equity practices. So at every level, there are opportunities to infuse equity consciousness, to use disaggregated data, and to consider how to support students in this online environment. Next slide. As part of our work in the CTE CoLab, we're actually focused at the program level. So we're working with Al's program, the network management program, and a number of other programs in various sectors. And so we're kind of dividing this work into different categories. So there's the overarching equity practices that I just talked about, but also we're looking at issues around student engagement, curriculum design and delivery, and the pathways to further education and employment. So I'm really excited for this discussion today. I know a lot of you are coming from a state perspective, and so I'm eager to talk about the role states can play in supporting equity in online CTE.
Great, thank you so much, Shane. I'm now going to pass it over so that we can hear from Al.
Thank you, Haley. So again, my name is Al Leaston. I am a program director in the IT division at Wake Tech Community College. Wake Tech is the largest community college in North Carolina system. We serve approximately 70,000 students. That's curriculum and continuing education. So in my position as a program director, I provide leadership to the network management program and have spent probably a little over a decade teaching online, seated, and blended IT CTE courses. I also serve as our program's work-based learning coordinator. And as mentioned earlier, I work on a number of grant and college initiatives, one being the CTE CoLab grant, which I've been working with Shane on for the last few months here, several months here, which really aims to reduce equity gaps for students of color in CTE programs. So I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Al. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Tara to share a little bit more about herself.
Thank you so much, Haley. So, hi, I'm Tara Smith, and I am with Jobs for the Future. We are a national intermediary working to advance economic opportunity for all. And we are part of an initiative called the CTE Research Network that's funded by IES, where we partner with AIR, the Association for Career and Technical Education, and Vanderbilt University. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the CTE Research Network. We are really trying to increase the evidence base about the impact of CTE programs and policies on student outcomes and increase the pipeline of researchers working in CTE. So part of our effort is to improve coordination around disseminating, understanding, and using causal research in designing and reviewing CTE programs, and to bring CTE practitioners and researchers together to better understand the programmatic needs for research applications. Next slide, please. So I'm here today sharing some findings from a study we did about the impacts of COVID-19 on CTE programs. We started at the beginning of our effort we had done an evaluability study trying to identify programs around the country that were ready to engage in rigorous research. As part of that process, we interviewed programs, got deep information about how they operate in normal times. So when the pandemic hit, we saw an opportunity to really understand how those programs were pivoting to address the various implications of the pandemic. And so we have a sample that we spoke with of about 22 programs, including both secondary and post-secondary programs. Programs that were operating at one individual high school or one individual college, all the way up to programs that were operating in multiple states. So we have a good mix of perspectives. The mix included as well programs in 14 states, as well as those 4 multi-state programs, and CTE pathways kind of spanning the gamut of animation and gaming, entrepreneurship, health, automotive, skilled trades. So we had a nice mix to really understand what happened. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I think is really important for our topic today is to understand that prior to the pandemic, almost no programs that we spoke with had any sort of online or virtual component. They were primarily operating in an in-person, face-to-face format. So in spring 2020, when the pandemic first hit, there was a sharp shift to virtual only instruction. One of our programs actually ceased operation in spring 2020 and had not yet continued, had not been reinstated at the time we spoke to programs in the 2021 academic year. But all of the other ones had done a sharp change to virtual instruction that spring. And then in the following academic year, really came back in a variety of ways. And this is where CTE kind of entered, I think, an experimental phase. We had programs operating in a bunch of ways that they had not previously had experience in. We had programs offering virtual only, a hybrid opportunity where students may attend some days in person and other days be at home doing virtual instruction. We had a lot of programs that had formats going on at the same time. So they would have live students in the classroom with them and students at home on the computer in the classroom at the same time, trying to do the same lessons and content. So that I think has a lot of implications for how what programs learn going forward. Next slide, please. The biggest thing we learned about was the changes that happened during this time period. Hands-on opportunities really had to shift that learning model. Some programs sent home test kits for students, so they had access to equipment and supplies and could record themselves taking blood pressure or cooking a meal in a way that would earn credit. Work-based learning really shifted for some. That was dropped from their curriculum for that year. Others really explored opportunities to develop virtual job shadowing and virtual internship programs. And we heard a lot about new materials or components as a result of new offerings from publishers and others. Teacher professional development was a huge uptake here. It was described to us as a leveling up of CTE instructors as they develop new skills in digital classroom management, using online tools and resources, supporting digital learning. And then the employer engagement shifted with the opportunity to engage in virtual platforms, do guest speakers virtually, and other ways. Really saw an uptick in employer engagement in a lot of cases. Let me stop there.
Awesome. Thank you, Tara. Really appreciate all of you being here. Very excited to have all of you here with us. So I'm just going to shift a little bit because I want to take a moment to dig a little bit deeper into the work that you all are doing and speak a little more about some of the lessons that you all have learned. So I really want to start off with asking a question about a commitment that we've made in our Without Limits vision, which is a focus on equity. And we know that online programs and delivery models like this provide a way for learners to have access to CTE programs. So how can state leaders ensure that online education can drive equity by increasing learners' access to high quality CTE? I would love for Shane to start with this one, and then our other panelists can jump in.
Great, happy to start off. As I mentioned in our sort of framework that we developed for thinking about this based on our initial foundational research, the ability to disaggregate data and really understand what the disparities are is essential here. So understanding what are the differences for Black students and Latinx students and Indigenous students, understanding the differences in these different types of modalities like hybrid, fully online, in person. And I think often we just don't have that information, understanding that what are the outcomes in terms of employment, right? And so I think state leaders have such a big role to play in making sure that data are available to institutions and to programs to really understand what those equity gaps are, and then to start to develop what is the plan of action? How do you implement that plan of action, and then how do you track your progress? I mean, I think the other thing I would just say, just a couple of other things in terms of what states can do, the resources to support the technology needs of students. I know that, there's a few steps from the state to the student, but just making sure that institutions are able to pay for that those technology needs, as well as the kinds of professional development needs that Tara mentioned, I think are really critical.
Thanks, Shane. I really appreciate that response, and especially about following up after implementing, right? Because you have to continuously evaluate and continuously evolve. Al, I know that Wake Tech Community College is participating in the CTE Collab and that Shane described earlier. So how is your program working to address equity to ensure that learners are supported for their academic success?
So Haley, that's a good question. Because we know most CTE students that participate in CTE pathways and programs go on to graduate high school, usually enroll in college and secure high wage employment, which often leads to economic mobility. So I think it's critically important every learner have the opportunity to benefit from CTE programs. So some of the most recent initiatives have come through working with the Urban Institute and other CTE post-secondary programs across the country to identify and remove barriers to access and address equity. So a couple of things we're working on. One is really examining our professional development. And that seems to be a reoccurring theme for our faculty, but particularly our adjunct faculty, to really ensure they're able to identify and recognize the non-academic barriers or challenges our CTE students face. We have found through our grant work that CTE students, especially students of color, experience frustration and anxiety because they don't know about or know how to take advantage of many support services we have available. So I think it's essential all faculty have a better understanding of these support services and are able to identify the non-academic barriers these students face, and we see professional development being a large part of that. We also are looking at implementing supports with an intentional focus on student inequities. For example, making sure all CTE students who take maybe condensed 8-week courses have the proper time management skills and supports to be successful in a condensed class. And also our efforts extend to our industry partners who provide high quality work-based learning opportunities for our CTE students. So we want to ensure all our CTE students are aware of those opportunities and have the technical aptitude as well as the soft skills to be successful in those opportunities, because a large percentage of CTE students who participate in work-based learning go on to obtain high-paying jobs and social and economic mobility.
Great, thanks so much, Al. And I love that you mentioned, making sure that the staff have the development that they need, because some of the things that you mentioned, those aren't reflective of what students are actually capable of, right? They just need the supports in order to be successful. Tara, I also want to touch in with you when thinking about some of the research that you had in your paper that you shared with us earlier. When shifting to CTE program online, what are some of the top considerations that educators need to consider? Or put another way, what do you know now that you wish you knew before the work started to shift CTE programs to be virtual?
I think the biggest, lesson from the pandemic was it really brought into sharp focus the technical and digital divide is across our country. Most programs were not operating in a one-to-one model where every student had a technical device, a laptop or a Chromebook that they could use. And so schools have really had to scramble to try to meet those needs. And then the limited access to broadband Wi-Fi across the country, whether you're in a rural community or in an urban environment, really was an equity issue in how students were able to engage with online instruction. And I think going forward, that investment in technology, both the device side and the internet access, is going to be the biggest piece to address creating opportunities through online CTE.
Absolutely. And was there anything that you were able to gather from your research that, spoke to how the shift to online learning, especially at the height of the pandemic, impacted work-based learning opportunities for learners? And can you speak to any examples of any sites that navigated this well, specifically centering learners and ensuring those equitable outcomes in terms of like access and participation?
So, it was for the work-based learning in particular, it was both the ability of students to engage in a virtual work-based learning experience, but also the capacity of the employer to structure that. So we saw more virtual like internships in entrepreneurship, finance, IT, fields where the employer was also operating mostly on a computer-based structure. We did hear an example in Miami-Dade. Their county public schools operated a really robust summer virtual internship program by working very carefully with their employers to make sure that they were structuring opportunities in a way that they could be done online. And so it's going to take that kind of real purposeful engagement with employers to make sure those opportunities are there.
Absolutely. So I also want to just take a moment and pivot to speak a little bit on some of the lessons learned, while researching and engaging in these models. And Al, I was hoping that you'd be able to speak on what the biggest lessons learned have been from the Career and College Promise program and the CTE pathways using the online delivery program model.
Yeah, sure. So, as we've been talking about, as everyone knows, the pandemic forced all classes 100% online. So for some duration, some institutions longer than others were probably online. And prior to the pandemic, we simply offered, I know Wake Tech, asynchronous online classes. So when I look at the pandemic in regards to online learning, it was somewhat of a necessary evil, which forced institutions to use their different online learning modalities that they may have considered but had not yet implemented. So not only asynchronous, but synchronous and high flex classes were used, like we've mentioned, during the pandemic, and probably will be continued to be used long after the pandemic because I think we're starting to see the values in these modalities. So for us specifically, I know a lot of people talk about access, but one thing we really saw was not only trying to provide access, but the stress. A lot of students failed during this time and stress from maybe just associated with internet access and online learning. Some of the challenges span from not having internet access to poor internet access, which we've talked about with the digital divide. And then the mere fact that if it was up to a lot of students, they would probably never take an online class because it's just not a learning environment that everybody's comfortable with. So there's a lot of students that found out that online learning doesn't simply mean remote or distant learning, but in some instances, it takes much more discipline, time management skills, and initiative to be successful in an online learning environment. So we really wanted to provide support around those things, around time management, around being self-starters and things like that. I also think the transition, like we mentioned earlier, was so rapid, was really a struggle for several students, especially CTE students who might have benefited from a lot of the hands-on experience that our employers want them to have, which was no longer available kind of in the blink of an eye in the same manner it would have been if it was a seated or blended environment. So for us, we really worked on making sure students not only had laptops, desktops, or other devices to access the class LMS remotely. We also wanted to ensure they had the technical tools to access our lab equipment. That was really important for us that they could do that remotely. Also configure the network devices, just like if they were in a lab in a classroom. So that was important because the reason a lot of our CTE students are so successful in the job market is because of the hands-on experience we provide. So even in a synchronous or asynchronous or high flex class, we still wanted students to have that access and think of a way that they could have that access. So we did a lot of work in making sure students had the right tools to kind of keep that experience going.
Awesome. And it sounds like it continues to evolve, right? As you continue to
Yes.
learn like what the learners need.
Most definitely. It's definitely an ongoing process.
Absolutely. And Tara, I know that in your research, you touched on a bunch of examples from different sites, kind of what you mentioned earlier, but can you also speak to how some sites were just like innovative in their approach to these alternative delivery models that you covered and how they were mindful of the online delivery model and the compatibility of the program for each and every learner?
Yeah, we did hear a lot of innovative approaches. I think one example that I heard from both automotive and healthcare pathways was how they're used to doing those hands-on demonstrations in the classroom, and it's students grouping around the engine or grouping around a patient bed, and how taking the time to do a high quality recording of that demonstration actually gave every student a much better view of what was happening than they were ever getting in the classroom. And so that was a feature that I heard over and over again was going to be incorporated into curriculum going forward. And then the better leveraging the tools that publishers had around tracking student engagement and providing supplemental instruction and opportunities through those online resources. Another that we heard significantly was around doing more virtual engagements with employers, whether those were virtual career fairs, virtual mentorships. Several of our programs highlighted how they had really struggled to engage employers in more of a mentoring role. But having that virtual platform gave them more opportunities for the employer to check in and do a 20-minute conversation with a student and set that up on a more regular basis. And so that was something that many highlighted was going to continue.
Awesome. Thank you, Tara. And Shane, also touching on your research, because within the paper that we linked earlier, you shared that ensuring technology access, career-oriented advising support, and responsive instruction are some of the keys to reaching learners equitably. So can you share examples of how colleges in the community of practice are implementing these strategies?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of institutions, both at the post-secondary level and even the secondary level, which is not the focus of our work, but relied on some of the pandemic relief funding to support technology access. And so, this is about making it easy for students to access, and our college partners in the community of practice are focused on this. And of course, what's top of mind is like, how are you going to sustain this moving forward, right? These aren't one-time investments. It requires ongoing investment. One challenge is that in some programs, right, the Chromebook is not an answer, right? Especially we have one program that's a digital design program, and they have to be able to run Adobe, and they need much more advanced system and software to be able to support students. And so they're exploring innovative ways to allow students to access maybe remotely some of the software platforms, but other kinds of strategies to try to really promote that access, and then looking for funding moving forward to like really institutionalize these kinds of supports, right? So that students are able to benefit. I think with respect to instruction, it's really about making sure programs are culturally responsive. So this is about reflecting the diversity of the students that are being served in the materials and the outreach, but also in the pedagogy, right? So how are you making sure you're designing, even in the online space, you're meeting the needs of diverse learners. And then I think really elevating the student voice is so important. And that's something, when you talk about the word research, sometimes we usually think of the rigorous research that Tara's been talking about or that we do at Urban. But I think there's a role to really understand what students need. And it can be through the data that you collect. It can be through surveys. It can be through focus groups. And so that's something that we're really trying to think about, is how to to incorporate the student voices in the design of the programs and in the preparation of instructors. All of that, connecting all the dots there is so important. And then finally, on like the college and advising for careers, I think a big challenge is, you know, a lot of programs, they have employer advisory groups. Like that's one way you engage employers. And I think one thing we're working through with colleges, and we don't have all the answers, is like, how do you engage in these conversations around equity and racial equity with your employer partners? And how do you consider that, you know, in your outreach, and who you have on your advisory committee, and how can you try to reflect the diversity of students in your advisory committee to the extent possible. It's challenging, but it can be another way to really try to design programs to reflect the student needs.
Mhm. Absolutely. I want to open this up to all of you. Feel free to jump in, but I want to specifically focus on the role of states and what role did states have in incubating or supporting like these best practices?
I know one of the things we heard, we spoke with state leaders, state CTE leaders, particularly in Delaware and West Virginia, and they highlighted that they had really saw a need to do some teacher professional development around digital instruction and digital learning pedagogy. And so they brought in some training from the Southern Regional Education Board, their accrediting body, to support teachers in thinking through that. And that they also coupled that with teacher professional development around self-care and well-being, recognizing that the teachers were going through a really stressful time. Also, we heard from Delaware that they provided some kind of one-time funding opportunities that were highly flexible to schools and districts, recognizing that in the moment they needed to be more nimble in purchasing technology or the other tools that were required to meet the challenges of the moment. And so they created an easier pathway for schools to access those funds. That might be something states need to consider going forward, is creating a funding stream that would support this kind of pivot or this transition to more online learning opportunities.
Especially as they think of like different technologies that can aid in the learning that may not be useful right now, but as they continue to evolve.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I think there are still some unspent ARPA funds that either in state governments or within institutions that could be used to support students in terms of access to technology or other kinds of supports they need to be successful in the transition to online learning. So that's one idea. I think there's also the Digital Equity Act was included as part of the infrastructure bill, and I know there's planning happening right now around the use of those funds, but that, you know, is about access to broadband, supportive technology, and access to digital skills. And so just as a source, it's a source of funding to be able to support those needs. That is, I think, important to think about right at this moment in time.
Awesome, thank you. I also want to focus on any other like opportunities for state leaders in expanding access with innovative models and the components that help in actualizing expanding access using these models. So, I mean, thinking about opportunities that exist for states to support educators in the shift to online delivery of CTE programs. Would love to hear responses to that from the panel, if you have any additional thoughts there.
Well, I know, you know, there are several initiatives by the state to really, I think it's been said before, to look at digital literacy. That's really big, and I think people are starting to see the need of that. I know we have a digital literacy project in North Carolina, which aims to really bridge the digital divide. So by providing instruction and support services for those digital skills that are needed for a lot of our adult students for job training and employment. I know also specifically especially during the summer, like now, there is a summer accelerator grant program, which provides money for our students to cover tuition, fees, books, things like that. And this program will really help students who kind of lost ground during the pandemic to get back on track during the summer and really help them out. And there's also probably one of the most significant initiatives that I know we have going on right now is the Long Leaf Commitment Grant. And that covers tuition and fees based on family income for our students. And this is for students who graduate from a North Carolina high school in 2022. And it will be for the 2022-23 academic year. And then Wake Tech, our college, will provide last dollar scholarships to really bridge the gap and really fully pay for tuition and fees not covered by the Pell Grant or Long Leaf Commitment Grant or other state funds. So really for the next academic year, those high school seniors who take advantage of this would need to just pay for textbooks, really. So the state has really been involved and done a lot of things to support these efforts.
Those are some great examples, Al. Thank you. And Shane, I know that in your research, it's highlighted that improving data is an ongoing challenge. And what are some steps that state leaders could or should take to improve data as a means of promoting equitable access and outcomes?
Yeah, so I already talked a little bit about just the importance of disaggregated data by race and ethnicity, gender, and other categories. I think there were a few questions in the comments in the chat about this, although it's always hard, right? You have to collect the data in order to have it, right? So you have to ask people their veteran status, their parenting status, et cetera, if you actually want to be able to disaggregate data in that way. But, and then understanding the differences in terms of online, hybrid, fully in person, although I think there's still some fuzziness in the definitions of all those, which can make it a challenge. So having common definitions of what we mean by those things at the state level, I think we underestimate how much programs and faculty can actually benefit from access to the data. So often it's used in like a monitoring and accountability way, both for as a system, but like there's value in accessing that data at the program or instructor level, and then being able to connect it to other data points that are in other data systems. So like, you know, what kinds of supports do students need, which students need supports, and like how are students doing in their programs? How does that break down by race and ethnicity? And so I think it's really about pushing the data down so that everyone can benefit and that so that the data are actionable. I think is really, really critical in this work.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Shane. And thank you all for answering the questions that I had and just kind of talking through all of those pieces of your work and some of the lessons that you've learned. I want to allow some time for us to answer questions from the audience. And I know that you kind of just somewhat touched on this, Shane, but we did have a question from David Ellis that was specific about how do you find data on newer groups like military dependents, and what kind of questions are being asked at intake to capture good data?
I mean, institutions vary in the kind of data they collect. Often what we have is from like financial aid data, like on the characteristics of students is from financial aid, or it's from surveys. And often, I used to work at CUNY at the City University of New York, and I recall that like the participation in student surveys was very low, and so you just didn't have a good picture of some of the detail that you wanted. So I think, you know, you don't want to add too much because you don't want it to be too much of a burden, but thinking about the kinds of things that would be important to know, and including that as part of the you know, application process, the sort of enrollment process, so that you have access to that kind of information, I think is critical.
Absolutely. Tara or Al, did you have anything else to add to this question?
For me, and Shane already mentioned it, but looking at the data from that program level or that course level is so critical. It's easy to stay at the university, the college, or the school level, but we're not understanding where students are successful or what maybe the gateway courses or opportunities are if we're not digging deeper. So it's about getting data in the hands of the people that can think critically about what the student flow is through the program.
Awesome, thank you. We have a question in the Q&A. Another one that says, how did you adapt students in CTE programs to have the hands-on learning in those classes that they needed? I know some folks helped to answer this question in the chat, but want to open it up to our panelists to share any information that they have as well.
I know for us specifically, a lot of people went to like simulations, kind of online, the computer and things like that, where you could simulate the same type of learning environment with different applications. So what we did is a lot of our students use networking equipment, various networking equipment. So we wanted to make sure that the same network that was in our classroom, they had access to. So we had to set up that on their laptops to make sure they could access the same equipment that they could actually access in the classroom. Another way, and we had a lot of our students, or excuse me, faculty, go through lectures. I guess it's somewhat of a high flex where there's no one's in the classroom, but you have students online. And as you speak about the equipment, we could point out equipment on video, camera, show them this, show them that, just to walk through really what they're talking about, as opposed to using those simulations and things. We found that in that environment, especially a synchronous environment where students are right there, it was a lot more engaging. If you point out equipment, you could talk about it, have conversations about it. And that really helped our students, because we literally had students go through the pandemic. So we have maybe 5 or 6 CTE classes that are all hands-on. We had, and it was amazing, we had students go through our program who had never stepped foot on campus. Like if you started maybe that spring of March and with an online class and the pandemic happened, so you potentially graduated and had never stepped foot on campus. And now these students have interviews with Cisco, IBM, and it was just, and I'm happy to say a lot of them got jobs. I was kind of, they were able to get jobs based off, faculty really going the extra mile, or really understanding the importance of trying to recreate, hey, students aren't here, but we're going to do our best job to really act like, or try to make the best environment we can for them. And it worked well.
That's admirable, and that's the goal, right? We want them to have jobs. We want them to have a successful career. Absolutely. So awesome. Another
with an example there. I know one of the school districts we spoke with developed what they called reverse field trips. So their students were doing virtual learning, they were doing online instruction, but they developed for very small groups of students, they would bring them onto campus to get that hands-on time with equipment. So they were able to control the numbers and really spread people out in the lab through those reverse field trip opportunities. And so finding ways to maybe integrate or provide opportunities for folks to come in and get that hands-on time in the lab could be a way of coupling that with online instruction.
And I do think, just to build on an example I think Tara shared earlier, but like there's a certain value. So the hands-on learning is one thing, but like the career exposure is another part of this, right? And so I think there actually are expanded opportunities for career exposure because of this new, very virtual world that we're living in. And so I've at another project learned about examples where people, that were in young people in an IT program in the Chicago area were suddenly able to have access to like Silicon Valley tech people that they never would have had access to before. And so that's such like a benefit for people, or even just like the video. In another program, they did the ride along in an EMT, for an EMT was like a video of being in an ambulance, because they couldn't actually put the youth in the ambulance during the pandemic. So that might not be good for the work experience, but it could be good for the work, like the sort of exposure and exploration part of it.
Absolutely. We have another question in the Q&A. So when implementing CTE and post-secondary readiness and transition programs, they're really expensive for many school districts. Outside of ESSER funds, Title IV funds. Does anyone know of any alternative funding sources?
Well, I'll just say, so this is not, I'm not an expert on this funding question here, but I will say that programs that are implemented in partnership with employers, we had did a study of that. We were the national evaluator for the TACT grants, the Trade Adjustment Assistant and Community College Training Grants. And we have a paper on employer partnerships. And one of the main things employers are willing to give is equipment. And so, you know, if you develop and nurture those employer partnerships, they can be a source of funding to support like the state-of-the-art technologies that you might need in a CTE program.
And Jeffrey also posted something in the Q&A as well for Chris, who asked that question. Another question, how do you expand a workforce development program into a CTE academy to address the need for the 21st century workforce, and what programs are most often overlooked?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. So maybe that's why we're kind of puzzling on this.
No worries. If there's any additional information that you can provide for the person who asked that question, that would be helpful. While we wait for that person to potentially clarify that question, we do have another question in the chat that asked, what were some of the research outcomes for secondary students with disabilities and English language learners?
That is a great question. I know, so as part of the CTE Research Network, we have 6 causal studies that are underway right now. One looking at the career and technical high schools in Connecticut, one looking at the career and college promise in North Carolina, and then like New York City and P-Tech high schools. Part of what they are looking at in each of those programs is disaggregating by student characteristics, including students with disabilities and English language learners. We were just having a call recently to think about how do we start pulling some of our analysis across those studies, specifically for students with disabilities. So I know I could say that data will be coming out. We'll be coming out with some findings on that here in the near future, but I couldn't point to any specifics. We're still talking through design pieces there.
Thank you, Tara. Also, just one more chance for the question that we needed a bit more clarification on. Robin Givens, I know that was your question. If you could just clarify, we'd be more than happy to answer as best that we possibly can. Hopefully I'm sorry, she just shared. Some CTE programs overlook programs that have not expanded its curriculum for the 21st century. Therefore, what would be the best way to expand?
I think part of that is really working with the local employer community, looking at your local and regional labor market information to understand where the demands are, and then adapting to that. I just actually was reading a report about how programs tend to continue once they've been started without really considering if the demand has shifted. And so I think having that tight partnership with whether it's your workforce board or your other local workforce partners can really help to make sure that what you're offering is going to set students up for opportunities in your region.
Any other? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and just to add on that, you know, part of it's the data, like what are the projections about what's in demand, and then part of it's like the sort of more detailed information about what exactly employers are looking for. So as you're designing a program, like making sure that you're giving students the information on, or building the skills that are being demanded, making sure they're earning their relevant credentials. And so I think that alignment is critical.
Awesome. Well, are there any, if there's not any other questions, I don't see them coming through in the chat. We have maybe one more minute before we move to closing out and, next steps. So are there any last words, panelists, that you'd like to leave with our audience today before we get ready to sign off?
So I think, in all of the programs I spoke to, they talked about what a challenging time the pandemic was. It was a big lift and a test of every person within the education system to really meet that demand. But as they reflected on it, they really recognized what a difference going through that had made. It had changed the way they were thinking about how they could deliver curriculum, about how they could engage with students and parents, about how they could connect with employers. And so every single one we spoke to really thought that the programs they were going to offer post-pandemic or at this later stage in the pandemic were going to be different, that they weren't going to return to the way their programs operated prior to the pandemic. They've started on a new course, and we're going to be really more innovative and more open to using new tools and technologies going forward. So I think it's a real exciting time to be looking at CTE and thinking about CTE, because I think there's just a lot of innovation happening now. And hopefully we're going to see on that, change in student outcomes and opportunities as we go forward.
Yeah, I would just say that, we're at this interesting inflection point in our country. We can say, are we still in the pandemic? We start and see the numbers rising where we are, but I think, we have the Great Resignation. We have this sort of shift in what's happening in the job market, a whole bunch of new jobs being created, new skills being demanded, people reevaluating how much they want to spend on education. And so I just saw something, there's been a 20% decrease in the number of people enrolling in 4-year degree programs. And so it's just a moment in time to reevaluate what is it that students need to be successful in this new economy. And so I think really trying to understand that is important as we're going forward and designing these programs, how to make hybrid work for the most disadvantaged students. Because I feel like hybrid is probably the future, just because it does offer flexibility. So it's some combination of getting that engagement in person, but flexibility. And so how can we make sure these programs are designed to meet the needs of students and the economy?
Yeah, I would agree. What I'm thinking about is from a practical standpoint, I just know with, I've been doing scheduling recently, and I look at my upcoming fall 23 schedule as opposed to my 2019 schedule. And I look at the online classes, and I have these long waiting lists for online classes because I think people just got used to doing them, right? And so my next thought is, all right, I don't know when people are going to go back, right? I don't know when they're going to feel comfortable going back. So how do we create more support services? Because this, even if the pandemic subsides, goes away, this is where people are now, and they're comfortable in this online space. So we really have to think hard about, I know for us, definitely the next couple of semesters, and the way it's trending, looking at the fall and spring, people are just not taking seated classes like they were in 2019. So it's definitely a different mindset. If this is going to be the way it is the next year, how do we make sure these online students have the supports they need to be successful?
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you all so much for joining this webinar. We really appreciate your time and your engaging with us. We really appreciate our panelists who've helped to share so much information today. We hope that you leave this webinar with a greater understanding of the research focused on innovative CTE delivery models. And I also want to share that in addition to this meeting series that highlights the components of Without Limits and ways to achieve this shared vision, Advanced CTE is also currently exploring the opportunities for expanded access for high quality CTE and work-based learning within and across states to inform a CTE Without Borders policy playbook that will provide tools and strategies for state leaders that will be helpful in building a system that allows for learners to have expanded access. So we'll keep you posted on when it's released. But after leaving this meeting, please complete the quick evaluation that will pop up in your web browser. We want to make sure that this series is meeting your needs. And as mentioned, a recording of this call will be posted to the Advanced CTE website and YouTube channel for reference. And registration is open for our next webinar on Tuesday, May 24, focused on designing the CTE recruitment practices to reach each learner, and we hope that you will join us for that. As a reminder, you can find all of the information and resources on our website following this link that you see on this slide here, and a link to the registration for our next webinar will be posted in the chat box. You can register for that as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself in the follow-up email. We will also provide the contact information to our wonderful panelists in case you want to reach out to them individually. But I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for your engagement, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.